settle in. Let the light fall low, and let the hush of evening wrap around you. Tonight begins with a tale, the first of many. Close your eyes, breathe softly, and drift into the story of the velvet clock. Far beyond the whisper of highways and the rustle of calendars, past the places where time is kept in phones and watches, there rested a village wrapped in mist and memory. It was called Murrowmere, though the name had been forgotten by most maps. It lay where fog folded into the earth like soft wool, and where silence had edges that cradled instead of cut. Murrowmere did not keep time as others did. No alarms, no hourly chimes, no shrill rings. Clocks were everywhere, etched into teacups, stitched into tapestries, carved into windowsills, but they ticked slowly, kindly, as though not to wake the daisies in flower pots or the cats curled in window boxes. Their hands moved with patience, more like the shifting of clouds than the strike of hours. At the center of Murrowmere stood the velvet clock. It was tall, taller than chimneys, taller than the library tower, and glowed with a finish that caught the light like dew on cobwebs. Its surface shimmered with old carvings, etched in symbols that changed subtly if one looked away. Its hands, shaped like swan feathers, did not count seconds. They moved with sighs. And every evening, just as the sun disappeared behind the western hills, the velvet clock would exhale. A soft, warm breath. A sigh, deep and full of thought. And then, without a sound, its hands would drift backward, not far, just the smallest sliver of a moment. And the village would follow. Time in Murrowmere folded like a quilt drawn over tired feet. Days didn't disappear, they softened. Nights lingered a little longer, like lullabies not yet finished. Even the shadows moved slowly, thoughtful in where they chose to fall. The villagers accepted it like tea with honey, comforting, soothing, never questioned. It was simply the way of things. But one girl began to wonder. Her name was Thistle, and she lived in the attic above the library, a slanted little room with a round window, a writing desk, and shelves that leaned like thoughtful listeners. The floor creaked in tune with the wind, and the walls always smelled faintly of paper and lavender. Thistle had lived in Murrowmere all her life. She had eyes like candle smoke and hair that seemed always one breeze away from flying. Even in summer, she wore layers, shawls, scarves, pockets sewn into every fold, filled with found things, stones, petals, old feathers, forgotten keys. She was quiet, but not shy. Curious, but never loud. Each evening, as the velvet clock sighed, she would sit cross-legged on the attic floor and place her palm against the boards. She could feel it then, the soft shift, like the sky holding its breath. The moment when time turned gentle. And she would breathe with it. But one day, she reached for her favorite book, The Fogwood Fable, and found it changed. The cover, once green, was now plum. Inside, the heroine's name was Eleanor, not Miri. The final mountain had turned into a lake. The next morning, the baker forgot her favorite pastry. The birds by her window sang a tune she'd never heard. The library stairwell held a painting of a river where there used to be a meadow. Time, she thought, wasn't just folding. It was forgetting. So she began to write. A journal took shape on her desk, filled with sketches of shifting streets, notes on vanished smells, scraps of poems she was afraid would vanish. She tied paper tags to her bedpost, each bearing a memory she didn't want to lose. The velvet clock sighed. But Thistle listened deeper. Behind the velvet clock stood a house hidden by ivy and willows. Its door was shaped like a question mark, and its windows blinked softly with the memory of candlelight. Few noticed it, and those who did soon forgot. There lived Mr. Everdawn. No one knew if it was his first name or last. His coat shimmered like it had been sewn from twilight, and his spectacles curved like sideways hourglasses with silver sand that never quite settled. Thistle had never spoken to him. But one day, her feet took her there without asking. The door opened before she knocked. Mr. Everdawn sat in a chair of roots, sipping tea that shimmered blue and silver. "You've noticed," he said, voice like a wind through lace. She sat on a mossy stool. "The clock," she said. "It's not just folding time. It's losing it." He nodded slowly. "Time is not a river. It is a loom. The velvet clock weaves gently, smoothing tangled threads. But sometimes, too gently. And pieces fall through. Can they be found again?" He rose and led her through a garden gate. The air thickened. The sky shimmered like dreamglass. "This," he said, "is the garden of hours." Flowers shaped like sundials and bells bloomed from the soil. Some ticked softly. Others pulsed with breath. "Each blossom," he said, "holds a moment someone lost. A laugh. A scent. A name." Thistle knelt beside a violet bloom. It opened. And for one heartbeat, her mother's voice whispered her name. Not memory. A return. Sleep did not come easily to Thistle after the garden. Not because she feared, but because her heart now glowed with wonder too large for dreaming. She lay in her attic bed, eyes tracing the silver webwork of moonlight on the ceiling beams, thinking of ticking petals and breath-shaped blossoms. If a moment can bloom, she thought, then where else might they rest? Before the first bird stirred, Thistle rose. She wrapped herself in her moth-worn shawl, lit her lantern with a whisper of matchlight, and tiptoed through the library below, past rows of slumbering books, some of which hummed faintly in their sleep. In the oldest part of the library, where the walls bowed and the air smelled of chimney soot and forgotten lace, she found a door she had never seen. It bore no knob, only a small wooden sign. The Archive of Lost Things. She pressed her hand against the wood. It grew warm, and then the door opened with a sigh. Inside, light did not come from flame, but from memory. The shelves were lined with jars, each labeled with aching tenderness. The feel of a grandfather's coat. The sound of a name once spoken every morning. The scent of rain on the day she left. There were drawers full of buttons, shapes and sizes from coats no one recalled wearing. Baskets of keys that unlocked nothing. Threads from scarves long turned to dust. Music boxes with only half melodies. And pages, fluttering gently in the still air, letters, recipes, poems, sketches. some written by hands long gone. Thistle wandered slowly. She did not touch. She only read, and wrote. In her journal, she gave names to forgotten things. She copied labels. She drew shelves and notes. She whispered kindness to each jar as if it were a sleeping bird. When she left, her lantern glowed brighter. And it smelled faintly of lilacs, and lost birthdays. That night, the velvet clock did not sigh. It whispered. Word of Thistle's discoveries moved like the scent of bread at dawn, slow, warm, and everywhere at once. The breeze carried it. The birds hummed it between songs. The library's shelves, always fond of quiet gossip, rustled gently when no one watched. One morning, Thistle found a note tucked under her teacup. In the baker's tidy script, it read, "I used to sing when I needed dough. Did I forget, or did the song forget me?" So it began. The town gathered without needing a summons. They came not with questions, but with wonder. No one asked how the girl in the attic knew what she knew. They simply brought their own fragments, half-remembered tunes, photographs with uncertain names, scarves that smelled of wood smoke and lullabies. A decision was made. Softly. Together. They would hold a festival. But not of harvest, nor flowers, nor the turning of seasons. A festival of remembering. Preparations were quiet. Joyful. People searched under floorboards, inside teapots, at the backs of closets. They found music boxes with uncertain melodies, buttons from coats no longer owned, recipe cards with smudged ink. Each object, a lantern of memory. On the evening of the festival, the town square shimmered with candlelight. Tables overflowed with treasures once lost. No one compared or judged. They simply shared. A bell someone remembered hearing in a dream. A ribbon that held the scent of first snowfall. A lullaby no one remembered learning, but all began to hum. Thistle brought folded slips of paper, fragments of dreams she'd written before they could vanish. One read, "The fox wore boots and knew my name." When the velvet clock sighed that night, it did not turn back. It hummed, a low, golden tone, like wind through wheat. And the petals in Mr. Everdon's garden glowed. Merlemere remembered. And for once, it did not feel like something had been lost. It felt whole. There had always been a space in Merlemere's calendar. A blank square. A quiet absence. No birthdays fell upon it. No anniversaries. No rainstorms or star showers. The baker said bread never rose properly on that day, and the milk turned a little too soon. They called it the day that never was. Most accepted it. A little oddity, like the way cats sometimes stared at walls or how certain dreams forgot themselves before the kettle boiled. But Thistle, flipping through her journal, found something strange. For all her careful record-keeping, there were no entries for that day. Not once. Not 1 year. She took her journal to Mr. Everdon. He nodded solemnly. "It slipped," he murmured. "Between the folds. A full day, misplaced like a thought mid-sentence. Together, they went searching. They wandered the garden of hours, petals ticking softly around them. They sifted through the archive of lost things, past drawers labeled unfinished smiles, and songs that ended too soon. And there, tucked behind a dusty jar labeled things almost said, they found a folded slip of parchment. It was warm. When opened, the air changed. The clouds parted wider. The light grew golden. Somewhere in the square, a piano played itself. Someone began to hum a tune they hadn't heard since childhood. The day that never was returned. People woke that morning with strange joy in their hearts. The baker remembered her first love's name. A painter found an old sketch in the lining of her coat. A cat danced on a rooftop, silhouetted against a laughing moon. It was a day filled with small miracles and old feelings. When it passed, no one forgot. And that night, the velvet clock made no sound at all. As if it, too, was simply listening. It happened one velvet evening. The sky darkened in its usual hush. The stars blinked into place. The wind stirred through branches and tugged at scarves. But the moon did not rise. Children looked upward, confused. Elders checked the clock tower. The sky remained bare, waiting. Some said the moon was late. Others wondered if it was simply resting. But Thistle felt a stillness, deeper than silence. As if a thread had come loose in the weave of night. She climbed to the top of the library's bell tower, journal tucked under one arm, lantern swaying with her steps. Below, the town gathered, faces turned skyward, breath held. She opened her journal and began to read aloud, not with volume, but with warmth. Each page held moonlit moments, memories of silver walks, wishes made under crescent light, kisses beneath full moons, and paintings made with midnight ink. With each line, the wind grew softer. Then, from the sky, came a sound. A yawn. Not from anyone below. From above. The clouds stirred. The stars blinked slower. And then, gently, sleepily, the moon peeked out from behind a soft veil of clouds. It blinked once. Twice. And rose. Not in a hurry. But with grace. From that night onward, the moon never missed its place in the sky again. And once a month, it paused at Thistle's window, and winked. There are places the eye cannot see unless the heart is very still. Thistle found one such place just before dawn, wandering beyond the edge of the mist where trees whispered lullabies and the air held the hush of something waiting. She had not meant to find it, but perhaps it had been waiting for her all along. Nestled in a glade that didn't appear on any map was a cottage. Its stones were moss-kissed. Its roof grew soft with flowering ivy. The door opened with no touch at all, as though it had been expecting her. Inside, there was ticking. But not from clocks. It came from wind through wind chimes, from breath beneath blankets, from the heartbeat of old, forgotten stories. This was the house between moments. Time moved strangely there. A kettle boiled in reverse. A clock pendulum swung once every minute, then not at all. A song echoed in the air before the singer took a breath to begin. In one sun-dappled room, Thistle found a table of journals, each worn and delicate. Some looked like her own. But the handwriting changed. Some spoke of Merlemere as it was. Others told of what it might have been. Different names. Different paths. Different choices. In one version, she had never climbed the tower. In another, the clock had never sighed. And still, she was always Thistle. She stayed in the house until the velvet tug of the present drew her gently back. The door closed behind her without a sound. Outside, the world was unchanged. But within her, the hush of all the lives she could have lived rested gently. And she knew, more than ever, that she had chosen this one. The velvet clock had folded time for as long as anyone remembered. Its sigh had softened life, slowed it, stitched each day to the next like velvet ribbon. But after the festival of remembering, after the return of the missing day, after the moon's shy reappearance, something began to shift. The villagers didn't notice it all at once. But it began with small things. A teacup that refilled itself with just the right warmth. A cat that began speaking in dreams. A wind chime that played lullabies which soothed aching bones and old griefs. Then, larger changes. Trees opened their trunks to reveal hidden rooms, filled with laughter. Stones whispered forgotten bedtime tales to children who placed their palms upon them. Lakes mirrored not just faces, but fondest memories, days when the world had felt whole and hearts were still unbroken. No one was frightened. It all felt natural. As though the world had always meant to be this way. As though time, now unfurled, was finally stretching its limbs after a long sleep. The velvet clock no longer sighed at dusk. Its hands moved freely, sometimes forward, sometimes back, sometimes in slow spirals like dandelion seeds on the breeze. It wasn't broken. It had simply become free. And across Merlemere, life grew not faster, but deeper. Wider. Softer. With the unfolding came something new. The archive beneath the library, once filled only with what had been lost, began to shimmer with change. Where once stood dusty jars and long-forgotten letters, now there were shelves of reclaimed joys, of laughter returned. The sign at the door shifted its script. It now read: The Archive of Found Things. Children brought dreams they'd caught in morning jars, sealed with ribbon. Grandparents placed handkerchiefs that smelled of their youth. Lovers wrote poems to the moments that had almost slipped away, and now glowed like fireflies in the dark. Thistle continued her writing, but now with a steadier heart. Her journal swelled with not just memories kept, but moments rediscovered. The archive began to hum. Not with sorrow, but with warmth. It had become a place not of mourning, but of reunion. One afternoon, Thistle found her mother's laughter bottled in a tiny vial, sealed with wax. She held it to her ear. And it sang. Outside, the velvet clock turned sideways, just for a moment. And in doing so, showed a single word etched behind its hands. Remember. One golden afternoon, Thistle wandered into Mr. Everdawn's garden once more. The flowers of hours had grown thick and bright. Petals shaped like sundials bowed in the breeze. Bells rang with the sound of remembered hugs. The air pulsed with old joy and warmth. But at the very edge of the garden stood one unopened bloom. It was pale, quiet, and still. Its shape was that of an hourglass turned on its side. Mr. Everdawn stood beside it, his hands tucked behind his back. "It's the last petal," he whispered. The moment Merlemere forgot it could dream. Thistle stepped forward. She touched the bloom. It unfurled, slowly, tenderly. A hush spread through the garden. And then, every flower opened in unison. Time shimmered in the air. The garden glowed. People paused across the village, sensing something just beyond their breath. The velvet clock turned once more. But this time, not backward. Not forward. Not sideways. It turned inward, spiraling like a shell. And then it sighed. A long, full, contented breath. One evening, long after the stars had stitched themselves into the sky, Thistle sat beside the velvet clock. The air was warm. The world was quiet. The town shimmered with soft lamps and shared silences. Mr. Everdawn sat beside her, his coat glinting with threads of old wishes. "Is it finished?" she asked softly. He smiled. "Stories don't finish," he said. "They rest." The clock beside them no longer ticked to push time onward. It no longer sighed to smooth time's weave. It simply sat and listened. Merlemere no longer feared forgetting. Its people remembered together, in songs, in tea, in quiet nods and long walks. In letters tucked beneath pillows. In candles lit on windowsills. And the velvet clock. It remembered too. Not everything. But enough. It remembered the girl in the attic. The journal full of nearly lost names. The petals that ticked. The moments that bloomed. And the town that slowed, not to fall behind, but to feel. And in the hush between one moment and the next, it sighed once more. Not to turn time back, but to bless the now. The velvet clock has sighed its last for the evening, and time now drifts differently. Let the hush deepen, and follow the wind through soft willows and quiet memory. The next tale begins, wrapped in leaves and silence. It is called The Whispering Willow. There were places that belonged to maps, and places that belonged only to memory. Windlight Hollow was the second kind. It didn't show itself easily, it arrived with the hush of a turning season, when the light grew long and golden, and the dandelions released their silver breath into the wind. It was on such a day that Emery wandered beyond the edge of Fernstead, her village wrapped in the usual quiet of a late spring afternoon. She had followed a single floating seed, one of those drifting ghosts of a dandelion, through the wildflower fields and across the sleepy stream. It danced just out of reach, tumbling on unseen breezes, turning once in a circle as if teasing her before gliding onward. And then the wind changed. It wasn't stronger, only older. softer. It smelled faintly of lavender and pages that had been read 100 times. When Emery lifted her eyes, the world seemed to exhale, and the hollow appeared. Windlight Hollow opened like a story forgotten in a drawer, full of light that shifted like a daydream. The grasses grew taller there, the trees bowed inward as though listening, and the hush in the air was not emptiness, but presence. There, in the very center of the hollow, stood a house. Blue-gray, with a roof like folded wings and windows that glowed like late evening stars. Emery didn't wonder how it had gotten there. She only knew, in the slow and certain way one knows the rhythm of a lullaby, that the house had always been there, waiting. The front door creaked open at her approach, not as a welcome, but more like a sigh of recognition. The floorboards inside felt warm, worn smooth by footsteps that might not have belonged to anyone she knew. There was no dust, no cobwebs, only the scent of lemon balm and old candle wax, and the drowsy hum of a place long inhabited by quiet things. A table stood beneath the window, where a vase of perfect dandelion puffs sat, each one whole and untouched despite the open windows and the breeze. Emery reached out and paused. The air hummed faintly, and not with sound, but something deeper. Then she heard it. A whisper, not from another room, nor from behind her, but from within the house itself. "Welcome, dream keeper." Emery stood very still, her hand hovering above the dandelions, her breath caught somewhere between awe and wondering. The whisper had not spoken aloud, yet it echoed gently through her like the memory of a lullaby. She stepped away from the table and looked around. The house was small, but its walls held the kind of space that made time slow down. Everything felt carefully placed, a teacup with a chip in its side beside a folded napkin, a rocking chair angled to face the window, a row of worn books whose titles shimmered too faintly to read. She walked deeper into the house, and each room opened softly before her, like the petals of a cautious flower. No doors creaked. No dust stirred. The air held that particular quiet one finds in libraries or after snow, the kind of hush where the world listens back. At the heart of the house was a room shaped like a circle. Its walls were lined with shelves, and upon those shelves sat glass jars, each containing a single dandelion puff. Some were pale and wispy, others golden or tinged with the blue of early twilight. Each one pulsed faintly with light, like a heartbeat slowed to sleep. There was a book in the center of the room. Its cover was soft and pale, the color of clouds before rain. Emery opened it carefully. No words. Only drawings, delicate sketches of people and places she had never seen, yet somehow knew. A woman in a red shawl looking over a sea of stars. A child cradling a fox made of leaves. A gate carved into a tree, half open. She turned a page and gasped. There, drawn in ink as fine as breath, was a picture of her, Emery, standing before the very house she was in now, her hand outstretched to the wind. She traced her finger over the page, and as she did, one of the jars above her gave off a soft chiming sound. The dandelion inside it began to spin. She watched, mesmerized, as its seeds began to glow, and the jar released a shimmer that drifted through the air like stardust. The house whispered again. "You have remembered something." Emery closed her eyes, and for a moment, she did remember, just a feeling. The warmth of someone humming nearby. The scent of bread in the morning. A story that ended with a kiss on the forehead and the promise of tomorrow. She opened her eyes again, and the jar had gone still. But the book now held new drawings. And outside the window, the wind began to sing. The book now held drawings that had not been there before. Emery turned the pages slowly, each one blooming like a memory just waking up from sleep. A swing tied to the tallest branch of an oak. A garden filled with rain-colored stones. A candle flickering beside a child's pillow, casting gentle shadows of wings on the wall. These were not just pictures, they were echoes. Emery could feel them settling around her like the hush before a snowfall. And then, on the final page, a name was written in delicate, dandelion fine script. Emery Solon. She whispered it aloud as if tasting it for the first time. The house creaked gently in response. A breeze drifted through the window and stirred the pages. From the shelves, another jar chimed softly, then another, and another, until the air shimmered faintly with floating seed light. All at once, Emery understood, these were not ordinary dandelions. Each jar held a dream, a moment someone had lost, forgotten, or whispered once into the wind. And somehow, the house had kept them. It did not hoard them. It protected them, like letters never sent but still cherished, or lullabies once sung and then tucked into the folds of sleep. Emery stepped to the shelves, drawn to a jar tinged with lavender. She didn't know why, only that it called to her in the way old melodies sometimes stir the heart without warning. She lifted it gently, and the seeds within trembled, then settled. As she held it close, images bloomed behind her eyes. A girl, not herself, dancing barefoot through the rain. A pair of hands weaving garlands from dandelion stems. A lullaby hummed in a language Emery didn't know but somehow understood. The dream faded softly, like breath on glass, and when she opened her eyes, she found herself smiling. She placed the jar back on the shelf, and the house gave a quiet sigh of contentment. Outside, the wind stirred again. But this time, it carried more than scent. It carried sound, faint, melodic, like bells heard across a wide field. Emery walked to the window. Across the dandelion field, a figure approached. Slowly. Calmly. Not with purpose, but with presence. The house stilled, as if waiting. And so did Emery. The figure approached without stirring the grass. They moved like a reflection in water, ripples instead of footsteps, shimmer instead of sound. Emery watched from the open window, her hand resting lightly on the sill. The wind seemed to gather itself around the figure, holding its breath. As the figure neared the house, Emery saw more clearly. It was a woman, tall and spare, with hair like silver threads woven from moonlight. She wore a coat that billowed gently even without wind, and a small satchel hung at her side. In her hand she carried a walking stick made of twisted willow wood, and along its length were tied tiny, faded ribbons that fluttered as she walked. She stopped before the door, then looked up at Emery with eyes that were not old, but full of quiet knowing, full of the long rhythm of seasons turning. Emery did not speak. She didn't need to. The woman entered the house as though she had done so many times before. Her steps made no sound on the wooden floor. She paused beside the dandelion vase, touched it gently, and then turned to Emery with a soft smile. "I see it has begun," she said, though her voice was like the wind itself, neither loud nor soft, but simply there. Emery nodded. "The house called me." The woman studied her for a moment, then walked toward the room of jars. "I am called Thalen," she said. "The keeper of the field. I tend what the world forgets." Emery followed her, feeling the warmth of the house stir around them. Thalen touched a jar at random. The seeds glowed faintly, but did not spin. She nodded once, as if the dream within had answered her. "You have the gift," Thalen said at last. "The house knows. It has chosen you." "Chosen me for what?" Emery asked softly. "To listen. To remember. To care for what the world lets slip away." Emery stared at the shelves. So many jars. So many dreams. "Will I live here now?" she whispered. Thalen smiled, but it was not sad. "For a while. Or longer. However long it takes for the dreams to find their way home." And with that, Thalen opened her satchel and removed a single, glowing dandelion seed. She placed it gently in an empty jar and set it on a shelf Emery hadn't noticed before, one that was blank, waiting. "For you," she said, "to begin." That night, Emery did not sleep in the way one usually does. The house itself held her rest, gently, curiously, cradling her in a dreaming that was neither waking nor fully asleep. She lay curled beneath a quilt stitched with stars that pulsed faintly when touched by moonlight, and somewhere, just beyond her closed eyes, the shelves of jars breathed in the stillness. In her dream, or perhaps in the hush that surrounded it, Emery saw a field made entirely of sky. It rippled like water, yet held the vastness of clouds. And there, rooted in nothing but light, grew a single dandelion, taller than trees, with a puff as wide as a bell tower. Its seeds shimmered like the reflection of stars caught on moving water. She reached out to it, and it bent gently, as if bowing. When she awoke, the morning light was soft and golden. The house felt changed, but only because now it knew her. She padded into the circular room where the shelves stood waiting. The jar Thalen had placed the night before still glowed faintly, the dandelion within gently spinning, even though no breeze moved. A small wooden table had appeared beneath the window, where a bowl of milk, a warm scone, and a folded piece of paper rested. The paper bore a message in curling script. "Write down what visits you're dreaming. Then let the house do the rest." So Emery did. She dipped a quill into ink that shimmered like moon water and wrote her dream onto a fresh sheet of parchment. The dandelion in the sky, the way it bowed, the way its seed seemed to carry something more than wishes, something true. As she finished the last line, a sound like soft bells chimed behind her. One of the empty jars lifted gently from a shelf, floated toward her, and opened. The parchment she had written curled itself neatly and slipped inside. Then, as if sealed by a promise, the jar closed, and the seed within settled into place, spun once, twice, and glowed a little brighter. It was hers now. Her first kept dream. Days passed in the house, though time there did not behave quite the same. The sun seemed to linger a little longer in the morning, and the evenings arrived on softer feet. Emery came to understand that the house was not built of brick and timber alone, but of memory and patience, of wind and wonder. She explored every room, each one revealing itself like the turning of a page. Some held only stillness. Others, strange surprises, a closet full of clocks that all ticked slightly off, yet in perfect harmony, a tiny cupboard that held hundreds of tiny, folded letters, each addressed simply, to whom it may concern, whenever they arrive. But her favorite was the window. It sat beneath the eaves of the house's upper floor, in a room that faced the field. The window was round, like an eye, and it showed not the outside world, but something else entirely. When Emery first looked through it, she saw names. Dozens of them, written in the curling shapes of clouds, whispered along the curve of a river, tucked between blades of grass. Some names were short. Some were long and musical. Some were just sounds that made her heart feel something she couldn't name. These were forgotten names. Names of dreams no longer remembered, of lullabies never sung to their end, of friendships that drifted apart like leaves in a stream. And yet, through the window, they moved still, carried by the wind, echoing quietly, waiting. Emery began to write them down. Each morning, she would sit by the round window and copy the names she saw. Not to keep them, but to witness them. Because sometimes, all a name needs to return is to be seen. Some days, the names would reappear in the jars. Some days, they vanished entirely, as if someone, somewhere, had finally whispered them aloud once more. It began one night with the chimney sighing. Emery was in the library alcove, curled in a patchwork chair made of velvet and thyme. A fire crackled low beside her, though she had never lit it. In her lap rested an open book of dreams, not stories with plots, but sketches and thoughts and soft colors that never quite stood still. The sigh from the chimney wasn't a breeze or the settling of stones. It was something older, quieter. Like someone remembering a lullaby from long ago. Then, the house shifted. Not in the way a building creaks or leans, but in the way a sleeper stirs, just enough to change the shape of a dream. The lamp beside her flickered once and grew warmer. The walls breathed in. And when Emery blinked, the room had changed. Not fully. The fire still crackled, the chair still cradled her. But the books on the shelves had rearranged themselves, and the floor beneath her feet now bore a faint pattern of curling vines, ones she hadn't noticed before. It felt like being watched, but kindly, like the stars watching the night bloom. And in that moment, she understood. The house was beginning to dream with her. She stood and stepped lightly through the rooms, and each one she entered responded in small, magical ways. A music box she'd never opened began to play a tune she used to hum as a child. A drawer creaked open to reveal a ribbon she once wore on the last day of summer, years ago. The teacup on the table held the scent of her mother's favorite blend, though she'd never brewed it. It was not frightening. It was like finding a forgotten sweater, still warm from the last time it was worn. The house, it seemed, was not merely a keeper of dreams, it learned from them, too. And in learning, it began to remember her. That night, she wrote again. This time, not a dream, but a question. Do houses have hearts? She folded the note and left it beside the dandelion vase. In the morning, the note was gone. And on the windowsill, pressed against the glass, was a feather made of mist and starlight. The first guest arrived just after the moon rose. He came without knocking, tall, with hair like frost and eyes the color of river stone. He carried nothing but a lantern, which glowed not with fire, but with soft shadows. He bowed to Emery without speaking and walked to the room of jars. One trembled at his presence, spun 3 times, and then glowed. He placed his lantern beside it and left, never looking back. The second came at dawn, a woman with a shawl woven of ivy and clouds. She whispered to the wind before entering, and the door opened for her like an old friend. She hummed as she walked, her voice brushing the rafters like the wings of moths. She chose no jar, but left a poem folded into the pages of Emery's dream book and vanished before the kettle could even warm. They continued, one by one. Not every night, not every day. Some left tokens, stones carved with runes, dried petals, words tied to bits of string. Others brought nothing and took nothing, only sitting quietly with the house as if remembering how to listen. Emery never asked their names. She didn't need to. They were dreamers, like her. Wanderers of the in-between, the not quite asleep, the nearly forgotten. People who found the house not by looking, but by needing. The house never grew crowded. It seemed to stretch, sigh, and welcome each visitor with the exact shape of silence they needed. And Emery learned. She learned that some dreams do not come with colors or stories, but with feelings, scents, touches of wind. She learned that the deepest kind of remembering was not always loud. Sometimes it arrived in footsteps across dandelions at dusk. Sometimes, it lived in the pause between 2 strangers smiling. There was one door Emery had never opened. Not because it was locked, no door in the house ever truly was, but because the house had simply not shown it to her. It had been content to let her wander, to let rooms arrive in their own time, like songs choosing when to be sung. But now, as the last pale leaves of autumn trembled on their branches and the dandelion field outside turned silver with morning frost, the door appeared. It stood at the top of a short staircase Emery hadn't noticed before, tucked behind a curtain of ivy that trailed from the ceiling like a green waterfall. The door itself was plain wood, worn smooth in the center, as if many hands had rested there long ago. It pulsed faintly with warmth. Emery paused before it, listening, not with her ears, but with her whole self. There was no sound, only stillness. Not empty, but full. Like a breath held just before a story begins. She pushed it open. Inside was a round room lit entirely by starlight. No lamps. No candles. Just stars, scattered across the ceiling like spilled sugar, some pulsing, some still, as if in quiet thought. The air was warmer here, though she couldn't say why. The floor was woven of something like moss and memory, soft beneath her bare feet. In the center of the room stood a chair. And beside it, a mirror. But not a mirror of reflections. When Emery stepped close, it did not show her face. It showed a field beneath moonlight, where dandelions shimmered like lanterns. And walking through them was a younger version of herself, no older than 6, chasing something just out of reach. The small girl paused, turned, and looked directly at Emery. There was no fear in her eyes, only wonder. Then the mirror darkened. On the floor beside it, a new jar appeared. Empty, waiting. But Emery understood. Some dreams do not come from sleep. Some must be remembered first. She sat in the chair and closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the room settle around her. And there, wrapped in starlight, she thought not of dreams she'd had, but of dreams she'd lost. The wish whispered into her pillow the night her father left for the last time. The sound of laughter through a keyhole when she hadn't known she was welcome. The hope that someone, somewhere, had kept a place for her. She opened her eyes. The jar was no longer empty. It pulsed faintly. The mirror had vanished. The room had taken her offering gently, without a word, and returned something else in its place. Belonging. The wind, in Windlight Hollow, was never truly still. Even in deepest sleep, it curled softly beneath doorways, stirred dandelion stems, and hummed lullabies to the trees. But one morning, the wind forgot to blow. Emery woke to silence so complete it felt like snowfall suspended in the air. No creaks, no whispers, not even the faint stirring of leaves. The house seemed to hold its breath. She stepped outside, feet crunching gently on the frost-kissed grass. The field stretched wide, silver and unmoving. The dandelions, though still whole, looked quieter somehow, like they, too, were waiting. And above it all, the sky was the color of unspoken thoughts. In that moment, Emery felt it, something had arrived. Not a visitor. Not quite. But a turning. The kind of shift that stories make when they are nearly ready to close, but still have one more thing to tell. She returned to the house and found Thalen waiting by the dandelion room. The older woman said nothing at first, just studied the shelves. Then she turned, her eyes softer than usual. Sometimes, Thalen said, the wind stops so that one final memory can settle. Emery looked at the jars. One glowed brighter than the rest, a soft gold that flickered like a heartbeat. "It's not mine," she whispered. "No," said Thalen. "But it's for you." They stood together, quiet as morning, watching the jar glow. Emery reached for it, and as her fingers touched the glass, it opened without a sound. A single dandelion seed rose into the air and drifted to her hand. It pulsed once, then dissolved. And in its place bloomed a feeling she had never known, and yet had always longed for. Home. That night, the stars came closer. Emery saw them not only in the sky, but in the walls, in the corners of mirrors, in the stillness of her tea. They gathered like soft embers on the windowsill, as if waiting for her to speak. But she had no words to offer. Only a fullness in her chest. A quiet sense that the dream she had been walking through was not only hers, but also the house's. And the fields. And the winds. And the time had come to give something back. She stepped into the room of jars and stood before the shelf that had always been just slightly too tall for her. Now, without stretching, her hand reached it easily. A new jar sat there. Unmarked. Empty. The house, it seemed, had one last space for her. Not for a dream she had written, but for the one she had become. So she walked outside into the dandelion field under the quilt of stars and breathed in deeply. All around her, the air glowed with quiet waiting. Dandelions turned slowly in their sleep. The wind was still. She knelt in the grass and whispered a story, not one she had written or drawn or read in the book of soft pages, but the story of herself. Of Emery. Of the girl who followed a dandelion into the hollow. Of the dreams she gathered. Of the names she remembered. Of the home she found where houses dream and silence sings. And as her voice drifted into the night, a single dandelion bloomed at her feet, though no seeds had flown, and no stem had grown. It simply appeared. Lit from within. She cupped it in her hands and carried it back to the house. Placed it in the jar. And closed the lid. The jar pulsed gently once, and joined the others. Then, the wind returned. But it did not howl or cry. It sang. A soft, silver song, filled with all the things never said but always meant. A song of endings that felt like beginnings. A song of rest. Spring came early to Windlight Hollow. The frost faded like a sigh, and the first shoots of wild mint rose shyly from the softening earth. The dandelions shimmered gold again, and the field no longer slept, but dreamed, awake and content. Emery remained in the house, though it was no longer only hers. She still wrote dreams and tended jars, but now, others came to help. A boy who painted with light. A woman who remembered songs without melody. A fox who never spoke, but carried old laughter in its eyes. The house grew, room by room, breath by breath. It became not just a keeper of dreams, but a garden for them. And Emery? She no longer needed to ask what her place was. She was the quiet between pages. The warmth before the tea cools. The gentle weight of belonging. And somewhere, beyond the edge of sky, 1,000 dandelion seeds floated on winds that knew her name. They drifted into places that had forgotten how to dream. Until the dreaming returned. And far below, in the hollow where windlight falls and memory sleeps gently, a house glowed like a lantern in the dusk. Waiting. Always waiting. But never alone. The willow has bowed, the lanterns have floated, and the echoes have found their rest. But the night still holds more wonder. A single dandelion seed drifts through the hush, leading us toward a place where houses remember and dreams are kept safe. The final story tonight is the house where dandelions dream. There was once a village hidden so well that even the sun seemed to pause before finding it each morning. Nestled between a meandering river and the edge of an old, whispering wood, this village had no roads that led directly to it, only footpaths that wound like old songs through wild meadows and soft moss. It had no place on any map, though those who stumbled upon it seldom forgot it. The villagers called it Willowmere, for the way the weeping willows gathered close around its edges, their long green arms brushing rooftops and windows, their roots drinking from memories beneath the soil. The people of Willowmere lived in a rhythm all their own. They woke with the birds, not the bell. They knew the time by the taste of the wind or the way sunlight touched the grass. Clocks were few and mostly ornamental, ticking softly in corners, not to command but to comfort. No one hurried. No one shouted across the lanes. Even the children ran quietly, their laughter floating like feathers. At the center of this village stood the oldest tree anyone had ever seen. It was a willow unlike the others, wider, deeper, older, wiser. Its trunk had grooves like riverbeds, and its canopy spilled downward like 1,000 emerald threads. The villagers called it the Whispering Willow, and many believed it had been there since before the village itself. The tree spoke, though not with a voice. It whispered in rustles and hushes. Those who sat beneath it said they could feel it remembering. It was not just a tree but a keeper of secrets, a listener of longings, a cradle of stories. Children were taught to visit it not with questions, but with quiet. They sat cross-legged on the mossy ground and closed their eyes. And sometimes, when they listened with the patience of old rain, they heard things, laughter from years ago, the echo of lullabies once sung, dreams that had drifted loose from their dreamers and come to rest in its branches. Each spring, just after the moonflowers bloomed and before the river warmed, the willow would begin to weep. Dew would gather on its leaves and fall like tears, not of sadness, but of memory. The villagers called it memory water, and they would gather it in small crystal bowls, catching the drops with reverence. Some drank it to remember. Some to forget. Others kept it in their homes, where it shimmered in sunlight and reminded them that time was more a river than a road. No one questioned the willow. No one doubted it. It was simply part of life, like dusk or morning fog. Until, one soft evening at the turning of the season, a stranger walked into Willowmere, and the tree did not stir. He came as the mist does, quietly, without warning, and entirely at home. One morning, just after the sun had risen behind the foggy bend of the river, the stranger walked into Willowmere as though he had always belonged there. No cart, no horse, no sound of footsteps on the dewy path. Only a long, worn coat the color of distant thunderclouds, a pack over his shoulder, and eyes that held the stillness of late rain. The baker's boy was the first to see him, peering over the counter as the man passed by the window. He whispered later that the man had no shadow. That even when the morning sun struck him fully, nothing fell behind him. Only light. Others soon claimed the same. He walks like a thought, said one. Like a song trying to remember itself, said another. He took a room at the inn above the tea shop and spent his days in silence. He ate little, drank only chamomile, and never asked for anything more than a quiet seat near the window. But each dawn, while the village still dreamed, he would walk to the Whispering Willow and sit beneath its great sweeping branches, his head bowed as if listening, or perhaps waiting. Days passed. The villagers, ever respectful of quiet things, left him be. They had no need to pry. But one morning, elder Male, who was nearly as old as the willow itself, took her polished walking stick and made her slow way across the damp grass. She said nothing as she sat beside him on the moss. For a long while, they remained that way. And then, in a voice like parchment being turned, he said, "It doesn't remember me." Elder Male's gaze drifted to the willow. Its leaves hung still, untouched by wind. "That tree," she whispered, "remembers the wind before we gave it names. But it speaks only to those who know what they've lost." He said nothing more, but his hand brushed the ground beside him, fingers tracing grooves in the bark-rooted soil, as if searching for something long buried. Then Elder Male reached into the folds of her shawl and pressed something into his palm. A folded scrap of paper. "Perhaps," she said, rising, "it is time you remembered first." Behind the inn, tucked between the stone wall and the bend of the stream, lay a garden that most villagers had forgotten. It wasn't hidden, exactly, it was simply quiet. The kind of place eyes passed over without registering, like a word skipped in reading or a note left out of a melody. It was a peculiar place, made not of rows or order, but of winding paths. Some were paved with soft river stones, others with moss, and still others with grass so fine it looked like velvet. No one could recall planting it. No one claimed to tend it. Yet the garden changed with the seasons, and sometimes even with the mood of the sky. The stranger, whose name was not yet known to anyone but the wind, began to walk its paths. The kind of place eyes passed over without registering, like a word skipped in reading or a note left out of a melody. It was a peculiar place, made not of rows or order, but of winding paths. Some were paved with soft river stones, others with moss, and still others with grass so fine it looked like velvet. No one could recall planting it. No one claimed to tend it. Yet the garden changed with the seasons, and sometimes even with the mood of the sky. The stranger, whose name was not yet known to anyone but the wind, began to walk its paths. Each morning, after his visit to the willow, he would step into the garden and wander. His steps were slow, almost thoughtful, as if the ground beneath him were whispering directions. And each evening, he returned to the inn with something in his hands. A river-smoothed stone. A feather with a stripe of silver. A ribbon, curled like a sleeping snake. A ring dulled with age. He never spoke of these things, but placed them carefully along the edge of his windowsill, where moonlight could rest upon them. The children began to notice. They started leaving their own offerings near the garden's entrance, a small bell, a polished marble, drawings and scribbled notes. The stranger never took them, but somehow, by morning, the items would be rearranged into shapes. A spiral. A constellation. A sleeping fox made of pebbles. Some believed the garden was revealing forgotten paths, not of places, but of thoughts. Of memories misplaced, waiting patiently in the grass. Elder Male, watching from her window with eyes like wet stones, nodded to herself. She remembered the year the garden first bloomed. It had been the same year the willow wept for the first time. She knew, then, that the tree and the garden were kin. Both remembered what people tried to forget. Summer deepened into gold and hush, and with it came the candle moths. Once a year, on the stillest night between the last thunderstorm and the first ripening apple, they arrived. No one knew where from. They came like wishes, silent, glowing, winged. Their wings shimmered like pearl, and they moved with a grace that made the breath slow just to watch them. They were drawn to light, but not just any light. It had to be warm, flickering, made with care. So the villagers prepared lanterns for them, delicate globes of glass and colored wax, hung from the willow's low-hanging boughs. When dusk fell on the night of their arrival, the entire tree came alight. Candles in amber glass glowed like stars, and the whispering willow swayed ever so slightly, though the air was still. The stranger stood beneath it, motionless. A candle moth landed on his shoulder, and unlike the others, it did not move. It stayed, its wings pulsing gently with light. And for the first time, he spoke, not to any person, but to the tree. He whispered a name. It was not his own, but that of a girl. The name fell from his lips like rain onto dry earth. It echoed, almost, in the hush beneath the branches. The willow shivered. A single leaf broke free and spiraled down. He caught it without looking. His hand closed over it, and tears slipped from his eyes, slow, quiet, like memory itself returning. He did not speak again that night. But the moth remained on his shoulder until morning. Dawn arrived without sound. The village lay hushed beneath a sky the color of old parchment. Morning glories curled around windows, still closed, and not even the roosters crowed. It was as if the whole of Willowmere held its breath. Under the whispering willow, the stranger knelt. He had not moved all night. The candle moth on his shoulder had gone, but the trace of its light remained, faint, like the scent of a forgotten room. Around him, the grass was wet, not with dew, but with the shimmering droplets the willow released only once each year. Memory water. He held a glass bowl in his hands. Somehow, it had found him, or he had found it. Its rim was etched with tiny runes, older than the village, older even than the willow. Inside, the liquid swirled slowly, catching morning light and holding it still. Elder Male approached, silent in her step as always. Her eyes searched his face. "She was your sister," she said, not as a question, but as a truth spoken gently into being. He nodded once. "You forgot." He did not answer. Instead, he lifted the bowl and drank. The taste was unlike anything, neither sweet nor bitter, neither cold nor warm. It was the echo of a song hummed long ago. The softness of a blanket tucked in childhood. The scent of her hair when she leaned in to whisper a secret and then forgot the words. When he lowered the bowl, something had changed. Behind him, on the grass, his shadow had returned. It stretched gently in the sunlight, curved like an old friend's smile. From that day on, the villagers began to speak his name, Lorien. He never offered it himself, but it passed from lips to lips with ease, like a story the village had always known. He stayed, though no one asked him to. He swept the steps of the inn in the early mornings, helped children untangle kites from low tree branches. He visited the willow each dawn but no longer sat in silence, he whispered softly, as if giving the tree back what it had kept safe for him. But more than that, he began to draw. Using parchment from the weaver's cupboard and charcoal from the hearth, Lorien began to map the village. Not its roads or rooftops, not its wells or its gardens, but its whispers. He mapped where the widow sang to her cat when she thought no one listened, the corner where a soldier once kissed a letter before sending it off, the bench where a boy had once decided he was brave enough to say what he felt. He charted echoes, not places. The children watched him work and asked questions. He would smile and answer only one way: it's a guide for hearts. So even silence has a path. When the map was finished, he pinned it to the inn's common wall. And each morning after that, someone could be seen tracing a line on it with their fingers, pausing where a memory stirred. And from the willow, a single leaf would flutter down, not in sadness, but in blessing. At the far edge of Willowmere, where the meadow dissolved into wild mint and whispergrass, stood a small stone house that had long since closed itself to the world. Its shutters were always drawn, its chimney cold, its path overgrown with ivy and thyme. The children called it the Still House, and they tiptoed past it on their way to the river. Not from fear, but from a sort of hush that clung to it. As though the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for something lost to return. One evening, as the lanterns were being lit and dragonflies skimmed the surface of the stream, a child chasing moths saw a light flicker behind one of the shuttered windows. She ran home and whispered what she had seen. By morning, the tale had reached Elder Male, who merely nodded and said, "Then it has begun." Lorien went alone. The path was soft with fallen petals and moss. He knocked once, gently. The door creaked open. Inside, the air was warm and faintly floral, pressed violets, dried apples, the wax of unopened letters. Dust floated lazily in golden light. And there, by the hearth, stood a woman with hair like early frost. She turned slowly, as if from a long sleep. "I knew you'd come," she said. Her name was Illyra. She had once painted shutters blue and grown jasmine in her windowsill. But long ago, her daughter had vanished near the river's bend, and since that day, Illyra had drawn the curtains of her home, and her heart. She had listened to the willow only from within her dreams. Now, standing before Lorien, she held a book in her hands. Its pages were filled with her daughter's words, drawings, pressed flowers, and the faintest fingerprints of laughter. Lorien whispered the name he had spoken beneath the tree. And for the first time in many years, Illyra smiled. The chapel had long been still. Perched on a mossy hill above the village, its doors had remained shut for decades. Ivy wrapped around its bell tower like a gentle reminder of what once had been. The bell's rope had rotted away. The pews inside were faded with dust and sun. But one afternoon, as mist rolled low across the fields, a sound rose from the chapel. The bell rang. Only once. Then again. A low, steady tone, not loud, not urgent, but enough to make the birds pause and the baker drop her spoon. The villagers turned to the hill and stared. No one had rung it. They climbed slowly, reverently. Lorien led them, a quiet question in his eyes. Inside the chapel, the light slanted like grace through the cracked stained glass. And on the altar, resting on a folded shawl, was a single feather, lavender and soft, the color of spoken memory. Lorien touched it gently, and as he did, his breath caught. Vision stirred, a child skipping stones by the willow, hands covered in river clay, a laugh that filled the air like wind chimes in summer. She remembers, he whispered. Elder Male stood at the door. The bell rings, she said softly, when something forgotten chooses to be found. And the willow, far below, bowed ever so slightly in the wind. Autumn came like a sigh, soft and golden. The river slowed, as if savoring its own reflections. The trees whispered more often now, and even the grass seemed to rustle with remembrance. By then, Lorien's map had grown beyond the borders of the village. It no longer marked places but feelings, spaces where old thoughts lingered like perfume in a closed drawer. The corner of the bakery where a soldier had once wept. A bench where a mother had held her child too tightly before goodbye. A window where someone had waited too long, and the waiting had become part of the glass. But it wasn't only Lorien who changed. The willow had begun to sing. Not with sound, but with movement. Its branches swayed with melodies unheard but deeply felt. When the wind passed through its leaves, it sometimes carried with it a name. Not shouted. Not spoken. Just, carried. A name heard only by the one who needed to hear it. And so, the villagers began to write them down. They took scraps of linen or pale bark, inscribed the names with ink or berry juice, and tied them gently to the willow's drooping tendrils using silver thread. The wind played among them, tugging softly, like a child trying to recall a dream. Some names were of the living. Some were not. Some were perhaps not names at all, but wishes, or sorrows, or moments too delicate for language. And always, the tree listened. Children began dreaming of places they had never seen, yet somehow knew by heart. Elders felt old griefs shift into something gentler. Illyra stood each morning by her open window and whispered her daughter's name, not in hope, but in gratitude. And Lorien, once a man with no shadow, walked now with light behind him, tracing the names the willow carried through the sky. It was Elder Male who suggested it. She stood before the map in the inn's gathering room, tracing a curve of ink with her worn fingertip, and said, "What is remembered should be released." So they planned a new tradition, the Lantern Festival of Echoes. On the last evening of autumn, when the light grew golden and the sky opened wide like a held breath, every villager gathered by the river. Each brought a lantern, handmade, fragile, glowing. But more than that, each one held something inside. Not fire. Memory. A pressed flower from a wedding long past. A scrap of a lullaby written on ribbon. A lock of hair. A bead from a childhood bracelet. A single word. The lanterns were lit not with flames, but with the smallest whisper each heart could release. They set them afloat, one by one. The river took them gently, carrying their light around the bend like a slow constellation returning to the stars. No one spoke. There was no need. The silence became the story. And from the whispering willow, strands of golden shimmer rose upward, threading themselves into the dusk like stitches across the sky. That night, the dreams of Willowmere bloomed like lanterns in every mind. And none of them felt alone. Winter came with silver hush. Frost painted windows before sunrise, and the river crusted at its edges, whispering beneath thin sheets of ice. The willow wore its bare branches like a crown of quiet prayers, and even the wind seemed to walk more softly. Then, one morning, something changed. At the center of the river, where the water never fully froze, a glow began to stir. Not fire. Not sunlight. Something gentler, as if the water itself had remembered how to shimmer from within. From that place, a figure emerged. She walked barefoot, though the frost did not bite her. Her dress shimmered with pale threads of mist. Her hair flowed like wind behind her, and her eyes held the stillness of a story long kept. No one moved as she stepped onto the bank, not even the willow, though its branches bent low as if to greet her. The villagers gathered slowly. Elder Male came forward, followed by Illyra, who clutched a small flower made of river glass. The girl stopped before them. She did not speak. She only reached out, and into Illyra's palm, placed a small, silver ring, a child's ring, long since lost. Tears welled, but Illyra did not sob. She only whispered, "You were never truly gone." Lorien stood a few paces away, watching. And though no one said it aloud, all understood. Some memories are not meant to be chased. They return when the heart becomes quiet enough to hear them. The willow shimmered in response, releasing a soft, glowing mist that curled like breath through the trees. The river girl smiled once, and faded back into the light. In spring, when the moonflowers returned and the river warmed, the willow did not weep. It hummed. Not a song. Not a cry. A sound that was not quite sound, like sunlight through leaves, or the hush between the last word and the closing of a book. The villagers no longer waited for the memory water. They no longer came only to ask. They came to sit. To breathe. To be. Children now told the willow their stories, small things, a dream about flying, a wish for a pet fox, a moment they made someone smile. The tree listened to them all, equally. Lorien stayed in Willowmere. He became the quiet cartographer of the soul, adding to the map, slowly, lovingly. The map that no longer fit on one sheet. It had begun to grow along the walls of the inn, through the floorboards, into the hearts of all who lived there. The garden behind the inn bloomed brighter each year. The still house was never empty again. And the chapel bell, though never touched, rang now and then, just once, when it was needed. Illyra opened her windows each morning and placed her daughter's ring on the sill, where the light could reach it. And the willow? The Whispering Willow remembered. Not out of burden, but out of love. Not everything. Just enough. Enough to keep the quiet. Enough to bless the now. And when the wind moved through its leaves at dusk, it felt like the whole world was exhaling.